everyone. With Blizzard's recent announcement to the World of Warcraft Classic server, I've been going and looking around, seeing what people have been thinking, and then thinking about it myself to try and, decide what would I really want from a Classic server. But at the same time, I've also noticed that a lot of people don't quite remember exactly how vanilla was. So, with this video, I'm going to try to give you a better insight as to how things were back in the day and what you may or may not be looking forward to. So, first off, with questing and leveling, this is kind of a general section. The the leveling in vanilla was long, tedious, had some gaps in it, and for some classes, a lot bigger pain than it needed to be. For example, hybrid classes had to have a lot of food typically. Actually, everybody had to have a lot of food and water so you could refill your health and mana. But hybrid classes in particular had a hard time killing things sometimes. Um, Mostly because of the way that the specs worked and how you got your abilities. So, um, for example, as a priest, most priests played holy. Very few played shadow unless you're a big PvPer or just casual. And holy was kind of a pain to level with. And it ended up becoming more efficient for quite a while to level just by attacking with your wand, because your wand would do more consistent uh, damage than trying to use your spells um, until you got the mind flay ability from your shadow tree, because most priests while leveling would put a couple points in their shadow tree. Um, Traveling while questing was quite a big pain. You didn't get a mount until level 40, and that mount that you did get was only a 60% speed mount. At level 60, you did get a 100% speed mount, incredibly expensive, and not terribly many people had it. Um, a lot of times during questing, you could go through an entire zone and still be within the level bracket that that zone was for, and that made it difficult, especially for horde sometimes, um, because you would get to about 30 something around there, and you would be kind of stuck with no quests, with no new quests, and that meant you either had to travel to a new place, like a new continent, and try and pick up some quests, or it just a lot of grinding. Vanilla in general was very grindy. Most of the quests involve you killing a lot of things and picking up a lot of quest items, or just that's what you did. I mean, that's really all you did is just grind. And if those of you who have watched the South Park parody of the WoW game, you see that they spent most of their time killing boars because it was the most efficient way to level. Kind of a throwback. This is kind of a throwback to vanilla because it was in some cases more efficient to level just by grinding. Dungeons took a long time to do. Dungeon Finder did not exist. Getting a group together was a big deal. Dungeons took forever. Dungeon quests took forever sometimes. Quests in general were a pain if you did them with a group. Just if it wasn't killing a certain number of mobs and you actually had to pick up items, the looting could take a while because some people would get it quicker than others. And typically loot quest items weren't shared like they are now, where if you kill a mob, everybody's eligible to pick up the quest item. Any quest items that had to be picked up off the ground, say for like crates or something, were sometimes limited to a number of crates that you had, which made that harder. It was just a host of other issues that went along with it. Mob respawns took forever. Class chains for certain abilities and spells were long and tedious. Then it's sending you to different continents and different areas just to say, hey, blah blah blah, you person, and then they send you somewhere else. And then elites, especially elite quests, required a full group or more because of how difficult they were. Um, Class quests like for the Warlock Succubus quest, that was a real pain in the ass. The Fellhunter quest wasn't that bad, but I didn't like doing that one either. You had to wait to get to a certain level to do those quests. Um, the skills that you learned cost money, and you had to go back to your trainer every few levels to check and see if you got a new rank or a new ability. Um, you know, the bank and bag space was really limited, and you had to make sure that you managed that well because bags were hard to come by, and a lot of times you were stuck with like an 8 slot bag, multiple 8 slot bags if you were a tailor, for quite a while because bags were not big. Banks were not big either. Uh, and plus, when you were questing, you would often run into areas where the density was rather high, and you could pull things from, you know, far away without even trying. Just the other day, I was playing around on a private server just for shits and giggles. Um, going back and just having some fun while I had some downtime. And there was an area in Elwyn Forest where you go through and you're killing Defias, people, and you're in this field and you kill two, and then before you even move, two more come running over to you, and then suddenly it's a swarm, and you're like, oh my god, what am I doing? And yeah, so that I remember that. It was fun sometimes, but other times it was just a real pain in the ass. As for gear, everybody competed for gear. Um, Warriors could use every, armor type. Paladins could use every armor type. Paladins would wear cloth a lot of times. Warriors would wear some mail. Stats were really weird in comparison to now on gear. There was spirit, there was mana per 5, there was um, plus healing, there was block, I think there was dodge, and it was not a clusterfuck, but it wasn't as intuitive as it might be now. Primaries also gave you extra bonuses like strength and agility. Like agility specifically gave you crit, dodge. I think it may have given you parry at one point. I don't remember. I know strength definitely did, but they both also gave you attack power. So warriors, an example, double dipped from those armor bonuses. Um, you needed sets of resistance gear for certain bosses and certain raids just to, handle the mechanics easier, which the gear also took a long time to grind and craft, and materials were not easy to come by. Um, each class had their own like secondary weapon, like a wand or a gun. Because Hunter's primary weapon wasn't a gun. Yeah, it was the one you used the most from your just shooting, but your main weapon was like an axe or a two-hander or a polearm of some kind. And then warriors and rogues also had those secondary ranged weapons. Um, Pallies, druids, and shamans had like totems, sigils, and librams, or relics, or whatever they were called. Those were fun. Some of them had special abilities, others didn't. Gearing was definitely interesting. You didn't really find people who had lots of epic gear. That kind of just wasn't a thing. More often than not, you would have people in mostly greens with some blues, or quite a few blues and only some greens, and then there were the top of the top who had like almost full epics. And even then, having a couple blues was still pretty common with those players, just because of the way gear worked. Professions were a big deal. Each class, or like each class kind of benefited from having a certain type of profession. Clothies, tailoring, enchanting was a good combination to go with tailoring because you could disenchant the stuff and then, make more stuff. Blacksmiths were good for plate wares. There were sometimes you could make, chain mail, for hunters and whatnot. Um, and then so it just depended. Um, Mats weren't easy to come by, especially if they were like herbs and ore. Some mining nodes or some herb nodes were just really scarce. Sometimes crafting patterns took a shit ton of like 6 or 8 different mats, and that made it difficult. Sometimes the profession trainer was in a really weird place, like in a dungeon instance in the middle of nowhere. Um, it was just a very, very different thing. It kind of added some interesting, you know, gameplay to it in terms of, oh, it's just not in your, city. You actually had to go find the trainer who's trying to, increase their, ability with their craft out in the world. So that's kind of cool, but it was definitely a pain sometimes, especially trying to go to Uldaman and clear through to get to your trainer. Raids, most people know, raids were 40 man, and then the one 20 man raid, which was um, ZG. I don't remember if the other AQ was 20 man. I think it was. I think there was, because there's the AQ with Cthulhu, and then the other one. I think that was added later. I believe that was 20 man. Raids had attunements and keys. A lot of times when you would make a raid, especially if you ever pugged, pugging wasn't huge back then, but there were some. You had to make sure everybody had the attunement. And then I know notoriously MC, a lot of people didn't have the attunement, but you could run people through the attunement pretty easily in Blackrock Depths, and that was always fun. Um, Jumping through lava, stuff like that. Gear drops, there was not very many gear drops. You'd be lucky if you got gear. The biggest loot system that I remember was DKP. Everybody, a lot of guilds used it to help distribute it. Every time you were there for a boss kill, and in some cases, if you donated materials, you would get DKP, which is Dragon Kill Points, and then you would auction off the gear as it dropped. And sometimes you'd win, sometimes you wouldn't, and that was a pain to keep track of, especially in the big guilds where there's a lot of people, and you had a lot of extra raiders besides just the straight 40. And you had to, that's what guild websites were great for, tracking, DKP. Um, Raids also, those guilds spent a lot of time putting an investment into each other because they expected you to be there on time, ready to go, and committed to the raid. Raiding was not always fun. Raiding was sometimes a lot of preparation, a lot of sitting around and waiting, mostly because you had to get everything set before you could pull. It's not like it is now, where you get 10 or 20 people, everybody buffs up in like 2 minutes, and then you're done. Buffing back then, one person at a time. Food, didn't have feasts. You had to have all your potions, required a lot of consumables. There's a lot of prep that went into raids. Warlocks had to farm soul shards prior to raids so that you could have everything ready for summons and soul stones and hell stones and spell gem, like the gems that you would put on your weapon. Like, I don't remember what it's called, but you had that, and it was definitely different. Um, a lot of things that you don't see nowadays. Class viability is another thing. Not all classes were equal. I don't particularly mind that. I do think certain things shouldn't be equal because not everybody should be able to do everything, and that promotes classes utility. And yeah, it does make it harder when you can't find certain classes to fill out your raid team, like especially in 10 mans or 25 mans. If you only have one warlock, or you can't even find a warlock, and their utility is incredibly important, it's going to be hard. But I still think, or I enjoyed it at least, having classes that were known for a certain role that they played and how valuable they were. Warriors, best tanks in the game, hands down. Threat, generation, mitigation, taunts, that's just what they were for. They were prop pallies. They were good for AoE threat, but they didn't have taunts. And most of the time, pallies got regulated to being healer, a buff bot, and out of combat resers. So pallies would run and stay outside the raid before the pool started, and anybody who died would get res by the paladin. That was kind of their thing. Priests, number one healer. Uh, Dwarf priests were really good for Oni because of the fear mechanic. If you had a dwarf priest, you had that fear ward. It's a big deal for the tanks. Each kind of priest had their own like racial specialization. Like shadow, like a troll priest had like a shadow orb kind of thing. Um, Undead priest had like devouring plague or something. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but each class kind of had their own specialty. Um, Shadow priests were mana bots. They were good for mana. Shaman were mana bots. Druids were mana bots because they had innervate. Shamans were good for totems, kiting because of earthbind and frost shock. Hunters were big kiters. Traps were only out of combat. You could not use them in combat. They didn't do a whole lot of damage either. Warlocks were CC machines and soul, shard providers. You couldn't use. Oh, well, yeah, you actually had to trade health stones to people, and you could have 3 different ranks at one point. And each rank was a different quality of healthstone, and in the game you could have all 3 if you had enough warlocks. That's why you had to have so many healthstone or soul shards, because there wasn't a soul well yet. So you had to craft a soul healthstone and then trade it, and that's one less soul shard you had. Mages were great for DPS. They were the best caster DPS. Frost and Arcane were the bomb. Frost was good for bosses where you had to have certain, certain bosses had vulnerabilities, I should say, to Frost, and that's what Frost mages were good for. Fire was more for PvP. Enhancement was good at PvP. Rogues were stupid OP at PvP. Warriors were great at PvP. Warlocks were like tanks in PvP. Warriors were great DPS, just like rogues were great DPS. And then, yeah, druids weren't really tanks. There were a couple. They weren't really DPS either. They were great for flag carrying in PvP. Going back to Shaman Enhancement was a two-hander user, and Wind Fury could proc Wind Fury, and you could delete somebody with like one hit because of it. It was really gimmicky. Just a lot of weird stuff, but PvP was not a big deal back in the day. There were a lot of people who did it. If you had PvE gear from raids, you were pretty much the best at PvP, because PvP gear wasn't really a thing. I mean, they ended up bringing it out later, but PvP gear was not as good as PvE gear, so that definitely gave some advantages. AV lasts for days, PvP wise. You could always go. You could pretty much go to school and come back home. Same AV you were on last night was probably still going on. It was crazy. There's a lot that goes into it. And class viability, again, not everybody's going to be happy, I think, if they keep it pretty close to the vanilla experience that it was back in the day. I would like to see things not be so drastically unbalanced, but I would still like a lot of the classes to be known for what they were. Sure, having other tanks be decent tanks is great, but paladins back then didn't have taunts. So, I mean, that was just a real pain in the ass. And warriors had Mocking Blow, which was a taunt, and a regular taunt. That's why they were so good. Community-wise, though, I think the community was a lot better. just because everybody was a bit friendlier. There was more of a stop and smell the roses kind of vibe. Um, the guilds were closer together, in my opinion. I knew a lot of people back in the day, just from the guild, and we all just kind of stuck together. You knew more people on your server and in your faction, because you would see them in World PvP, or you would see them in a dungeon if they're in the same, faction. You would learn who's good, who's bad, who's a ninja, who's a dick, and you would, handle accordingly. Um, you didn't really have Wowhead. Thoughtbot was kind of a thing, but even then, it was just the community trying to give you help, through comments, kind of like what Wowhead turned into. But that you really relied on people in the game to help when they could. And that was nice. The WoW community still does that, but there's so many more of us now that it's really hard to get the same kind of feeling. It's kind of like you're lost in a sea of people, at least in my opinion. One other thing, guild banks didn't exist. Mail took an hour to reach a person, which was a pain, but it was just the way it was. You usually went and met people. Um, Class abilities required reagents a lot of times, going back to the rating thing. Um, the guild banks that there were on alts of the GM and officers, so you could end up having drama that way, but people ninjing a guild bank or getting their account hacked and losing it, and so on and so forth. Um, I did think that was kind of neat though, but yeah, it's more of a pain. It's way more of a pain. I just remember sending stuff in for DKP just for raid materials like herbs, potions, stuff like that. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I looked through most of my stuff, and that's pretty much what I remember. It's what I looked up because I don't remember everything. But yeah, I would like to see them change the way questing works, just in terms of quality of life. Maybe not have so many gaps in questing, making grinding still good, but not as necessary as it was back then. Quest items that drop, I think everybody should have a chance to loot it, so you don't have to spend, an extra 10 minutes trying to get everybody the quest items instead of, you know, being able to pull or kill a whole bunch of mobs and then not have to kill nearly as many as if you had three or four people going for the same thing. Um, like mob spawns that were quest mobs, I really think that having people being able to tag it and get the tag for their credit was a great quality of life change. I really wish they would have thought about that sooner. Having, world items that you had to pick up like chests, crates, whatever. Not having so many limited spawns or make them respawn faster would be a really good idea. That would be helpful, especially in densely packed zones. Because I know when Classic comes out, there's going to be a shit ton of people, and handling that shit ton of people in a really old version of the game is going to be a pain in the dick. So maybe trying to make the questing part smoother would help out a lot more. I don't really want to see LFG added in. I don't want to see Raid Finder, period. Um, I don't want to see, uh, like, I don't know, pretty much most of the new stuff we have. The classic in itself was pretty good. It did have a lot of bugs, it did have its flaws, but I think questing, that is like the biggest area that could have quality of life improvements and not have the authentic experience taken away from. I think that would make everybody happier because then they're not, cussing out somebody that's not in their group for taking a spawn or being a dick and not joining the group and stuff like that. So I think that would That would help out a lot. But let me know what you guys think. I know I talked for a long time, went over a lot of stuff. If I got anything wrong, let me know. I tried to do as much looking into the classes viability and some other things as much as I could because I don't remember everything. I do remember a lot of things, especially like with professions being a pain in the dick and the trainers being in weird places. That stuff I remember, but certain caveats just so long ago. It's hard to remember all of it. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to Classic, and have a good day.